Hi, and welcome to the video lecture for Module 7, where we'll be discussing Gothic art and architecture. We'll mostly be talking about architecture today, although we will see a couple of smaller monuments than regular buildings, mostly monuments inside these buildings. What we're going to focus on today are further structural developments that are made in the Gothic period outside of the developments of the Romanesque. So there's a lot of continuation of certain ideas and certain architectural types, but we'll see new developments because of new goals that the architects and the patrons had. Also, we'll talk a bit about the cult of the Virgin Mary, and this is also the focus of your supplementary reading for the day. This is an extension of the cult of the saints, but we see the specific focus on the Mother of God. She was considered the most important human who had ever lived because God had chosen her to be the mother for his son. We'll also see a significant emphasis on light. That is, they are trying to let light into buildings. They're shaping the way this light comes through, and it has some really specific meanings for the patrons of these buildings. And finally, part of that emphasis on light leads to the significant difference between the outer world, the earthly world, and the heavenly interior that was created through these architectural type, but also this manipulation of light. So I keep talking about this light, and here I'm showing you the interior of one of these Gothic cathedrals that we will be talking about today. You can see the opening up of even more window space than what we saw in the Romanesque, and this insertion of stained glass windows, and this is a hallmark of the Gothic style. So you can see the windows up above, but hopefully you can also see how on the walls of the church you see this dappled light coming from across the nave space. So what you're seeing, these shadows of light that is on this wall, that's coming from sunlight hitting through the stained glass windows on the other side. So you can maybe get a sense of how this creates another world inside these buildings. As I said, the cult of the Virgin Mary is very important. This is from a stained glass window we'll look at in some detail today as well. You see here a frontal Virgin Mary seated with the Christ child on her lap. Instead of it being Christ enthroned like we saw in the Byzantine period, now we have the Virgin Mary as the focal point, as the most important figure. It's this development out of the cult of relics from the Romanesque period. We had this emphasis in the Romanesque on these beautifully decorated reliquaries that contained particular relics of saints. But now we see this idea of glittering gold and precious materials transported to entire building spaces, this huge emphasis on creating new atmospheres in these buildings to highlight these relics, but also just to create an interior space that's different than anything from the outside world. So as always, here is our map of Europe. This is showing boundaries from around the year 1200. All of the monuments we'll be looking at today are located in the northern part of France, even though I'm showing you here the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of England, Spain, which is split into several different kingdoms, the Papal States of Italy, which was what the Pope had control over, and even southern Italy here called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies that changes hands on a regular basis. Here I wanted to show you that area in particular in some detail. So this is centered around the city of Paris, which was an important Roman city, and I wanted to indicate to you just how close together these monuments are. So we will be looking at a monument just north of Paris at the city called Saint-Denis. It's now one of the suburbs of Paris. We'll also be talking in some depth about the cathedral at Chartres, and you can see it's only 40 miles away. It's a pretty easy train ride. We'll also look at a monument at Rheims, another easy train ride away from Paris. And finally, our last monument of the day is right in the center of Paris itself. The Gothic, as it begins to develop and as it flourishes, is really located in this one small area. Even though we won't be talking about it today, there are significant Gothic cathedrals also in Laon right here, Amiens, and the city Rouen right here. So this very important center for the development of this Gothic architecture. So I'll put this image here while I explain some background about the Gothic period. Like that word Romanesque that we had last time, Gothic is a name given to the style later. This was originally a very negative thing for it to be called, attributing the style to the Goths. Remember those Germanic invaders who had conquered parts of the Italian peninsula, for example. In its own day, it was referred to as the modern style or the French style, and it began in about 1150. There's this further quest from the Romanesque for height in these buildings and for luminosity. It was used in many different types of structures, but we're going to focus on churches and specifically cathedrals. The Gothic period was a time of learning. Many universities were founded in this time period. Paris becomes the intellectual center of Europe. There's a significant rise in urbanization in this period as well as trade. Urban cathedrals become major patrons of the arts, and areas around cathedrals function largely as towns in and of themselves. There's also a rise in religious involvement by everyday people. This is also when the mendicant orders are founded, which are the preaching monastic orders who go out into the world preaching to anybody who will listen to them, rather than staying cloistered, that is, staying inside a monastery and never leaving to go in the outside world. Gothic churches are covered in sculpture and stained glass, and so these lines start to become blurred in trying to separate these different media because they all work together as a whole. There's a few major characteristics of Gothic that we'll be talking about today, but the easiest one to see are pointed arches instead of the rounded arches like we saw in the Romanesque. There are other techniques, of course, but this is one of the primary reasons that they're able to open up wall space to include more windows, letting colored light inside. They like to make these buildings as high and as large as possible, and this is a good example of that. I'm showing you Chartres Cathedral here, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Here I'm showing you 4 different nave elevations. That is, we're taking a little section of one of the walls in the central area of the nave of these churches. Here we have Léon, Paris, that's Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres Cathedral, which we'll talk about for a while, and Amiens, which I also pointed out to you on the map. And you can see, this is put in chronological order, so you can see over time they were able to develop more new techniques in order to make the buildings as tall as possible. So you can see these are done to scale, so you can see how progressively larger they get. You'll notice that they share a lot of similar characteristics. We have the lowest part, the nave level, featuring the pointed arches. In the earlier examples, you have columns, but the piers become even more complex as you go on. You have piers with attached columns plus attached colonnettes, and these are called compound piers. The next level above is referred to as the triforium, and this is a sort of gallery level where there's a walkway where the priests, or if there's monks attached to this church, they might walk there. Above that is the clerestory level, which lets in the light. This is where you find most of the windows here. And finally, you also often see these roundels, which are also stained glass windows typically. But you see that from Paris to Chartres, and even at Amiens, they change the position of these. So they're able to make even more of the wall space seem pierced. You don't have this masonry around these rose-shaped windows that you see at Paris as at Chartres. There's much less wall and more opening. Here's a diagram of some of the vaulting systems that we've talked about and what we'll talk about today. So we've talked a couple of times about groin vaults. Remember, these lines where the 2 barrel vaults intersect are called groins. And here it's showing you the Gothic pointed arch. So that's a possibility, but far more often you have these complex vaulting structure. The one we're looking at here is called a quadripartite rib vault. That means it has 4 different parts. Again, we have the pointed arches here, and they put in ribs like we saw with the Romanesque. Here they're showing you the shadow of it like you might see on a ground plan, so you can understand how the ribs are working, what they would look like from below. Often you have a little, what's called a boss in the middle of those ribs that just is a decorative feature. And then, instead of this being proper ceiling, they build these ribs and they fill these in with a sort of webbing. So that's why it's referring to it as masonry webbing. So it's not really classified as a groin vault anymore, although it's inspired by that. I wanted to show you this diagram as well, just to point out a couple of more features that we'll be seeing quite a bit today. There's this great emphasis on reaching newer heights and having verticality, and you can see that with these pinnacles. So a lot of the Gothic cathedrals will have little spikes shooting up towards heaven, drawing your eye upwards. We also will see in many cases today the flying buttress, which you can see along the side here. This is another one of the major architectural innovations, allowing for more windows. 3 indicates the vaulting web, which I just mentioned, this masonry inserted in between the significant ribs. Here they're calling them diagonal ribs because that is the area they go to. They cover rectangular bays typically. We also have transverse ribs, which are just straight ones that go immediately directly across instead of crossing diagonally across a bay. At number 6, you see the springing of the vault, which we talked about last time. Number 7 is the clerestory level, where all the windows are. 8, they're calling this an oculus. Any sort of round opening is referred to as an oculus. Another significant features of Gothic cathedrals are lancet windows, which is indicated here as number 9. These are these very thin, pointed arch windows. I already mentioned number 10, the triforium level. This is another significant indicator that the building you're in is Gothic. And then I also wanted to point out these compound piers with shafts. So you've got these piers that are supporting the major weight of the vaults above them, and then they have all sorts of shafts added to them, which are partly decorative but also partly structural. Not only do we see stained glass as a way of permitting light and color into these buildings, but you also see a lot of precious objects that have similar ideas behind them. So here I'm showing you a chalice that comes from the first church we'll be talking about today. And I'm showing this to you because I want to emphasize this use of precious materials. This chalice, the cup of it, is made of onyx. You have golden handles, you have precious gemstones and pearls inserted into it, because these objects were seen as a way to transport the person inside the church into the heavenly realm, that the church is heaven on earth essentially, and it should be as splendid as possible. So this is the first monument we'll be talking about today. Here I'm showing you a model of the whole church and the plan of the apse end of this building. And this is the church of Saint Denis. It is the one that is just north of Paris, and this apse end was built between 1135 and 1144. Now the reason I'm only showing you this end is because it is the best example of early Gothic. The rest of the building is built slowly over time, so it doesn't really fit with a single style. So we'll focus just on this eastern end of the church. This is the earliest example we have of Gothic architecture. And one of its features is that it gets rid of the modularity that we saw with the Romanesque. Of course, we still have bays. Often they resemble each other, but it's not this simple addition of one bay just to make the space bigger. It becomes very complex. In this floor plan, you can see how complicated the vaulting is. So each of these dotted lines are showing ribs on the ceiling. You've got something really different happening here. So the dark lines, remember, in a floor plan are showing you what's at ground level. So you see these big piers on the exterior of the apse end, and then these are all columns. So let me just back up just a little bit to talk more about Saint Denis. Most of the elements that we assign to the Gothic period were used in the Romanesque. They just begin to come together in ways that they were previously unused. In Saint Denis, the elements of the round piers, pointed arches, wall buttresses, window openings, and the rib vaults were combined to create a very open floor plan, especially between the apsidal chapels, the ambulatory, and the apse. That meant that the light from the windows could permeate the entire space. So what we're seeing is this is the area that would have held the high altar, and then only a small row of columns separated it from the double ambulatory that we see here. And instead of having radiating chapels like we saw at Sainte-Foy and Conques, there's very little separating each of these chapels from the other. There's just a bit of a corner, but no serious wall space. So it's a very, very open space. Just to compare that a little more directly, here I'm showing you the floor plan of Sainte-Foy and Conques. You can see these radiating chapels are really distinctive spaces. You have a single ambulatory. Remember, this apse also communicated with the ambulatory only through the screen of columns, but still, it just doesn't have the same sort of systematic regularity and separation of the space at Saint Denis as what we saw with the Romanesque. Here again, I'm showing you the exterior of Sainte-Foy at Conques. Here's the apse end right here in comparison with the plan. So you can see the different roof levels of where the apse is versus where the radiating chapels come. So that is another hindrance to the spaces really communicating that well. Here I'm showing you a view into the roof of the nave at Sainte-Foy. Here are the transverse ribs that we saw with a very basic barrel vault, which you can see in plan as well. There were groin vaults in the aisles, but nothing quite as complicated as what we see at Saint Denis. And remember, the major innovation behind this, the major reasoning behind this, is to let as much light into the space as possible. Here now, instead of looking at the Romanesque, I'm showing you the Gothic example, again the floor plan of Saint Denis, and this is looking into the vaulting of this double ambulatory space. So we have a straight transverse rib here, going between the supports, the two columns, which you can see in a plan here, for example. And then we're seeing this 4-part rib vault with this 5-part rib vault here. And I think these give you a really good sense of how these ribs are built up. This is what it's designed around. And then masonry is just slotted in. It's a really web-like effect. So there's a lot of difference. We also see in the plan that the piers are quite irregular here. They're irregular in shape to minimize the impression of their mass. The creation of the pointed arch is what allows for this. You can add extra ribs to the vault, and this is a really common decorative element as well. It's structural, absolutely, but this creates a lot of diversity in your ceiling space. This emphasizes the ribs, especially these diagonal ones, between the transverse ribs. So they would build these wooden frames to support the vaults as they were being built. Stone ceilings are very heavy. We sort of talked about that with the Romanesque. Those churches are very large, but the Gothic churches start to make the Romanesque ones look small. So here's a view into this double ambulatory. Here from the wall, you can get a sense of the separation of the main apse from this double ambulatory. You can see this row of columns that separates it, and here you can see those incredible rib vaults. I wanted to give you a little background about why this is happening. Why are they wanting to build churches like this? We actually can pinpoint this to a very specific person. There was a man named Abbot Suger, and he was the Benedictine abbot at the church of Saint Denis, so there were some monks associated with this church. He was interested in ornate art and architecture, and traveled extensively enough to be familiar with other examples of architecture from the period. He employed masons from other regions to create the church, and he tried to incorporate the notion of light as a medium to a more divine state into the sanctuary. So he puts in larger windows to allow light into the space, because he thought that beauty and color was a means to bring the soul closer to God. So think back to that chalice I showed you a few minutes ago. That's another example of a material object that could be used to help transport the soul closer to God. Abbot Suger cited early Christian writers as a way of explaining his interest in this. So he saw light and color as a means of illuminating the soul and uniting it with God. And this is a belief he shared with several other medieval mystics. For him, the colored lights of gemstones and stained glass windows and the glint of golden church furnishings transformed the material world into the splendor of paradise. So these churches are trying to look like heaven on earth. The entire church would feel this way too, since the floor plan was so open, since the new structural developments allowed for this. Here I'm showing you a panoramic view. It looks a little bit funny. You can see the altar being shown twice, basically. These are the same candles on either side, just to show you how open this space is. They really merge together. The chapels, you can see here, altars in each of these chapels on both sides, but you can see how they start to merge together. The divisions between them are not made through walls. There's lots of glass in this end of the building. These ribs are quite flexible. As I've mentioned, they base the architecture on that. And so the vaulting system could be quite irregular here. And here I'm showing you the apse end also of Saint-Foy at Caen, just to remind you of how different these radiating chapels are. These do not communicate. They are fully closed off from each other. There's wall space between them that people would have to pass. It's just not like that at Saint Denis. That openness was part of what Abbot Suger wanted to help convey, this heavenly idea inside the space. Saint Denis is also very interesting if you're in Paris and have a chance to go there, because this is where many of the kings and queens of France are actually buried. So there's a lot of stuff to see there. Now I'd like to go back to this monument. I was showing you a different view of it before. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this. This is Chartres Cathedral, and it was built between 1134 and 1260. So that's quite a lot of time. These things took a lot of time to build. One result of that is the fact that they change pretty considerably from one end to the other. When you're building a church, the first thing you build is the most important space, the apse with the high altar. Typically then they would add the rest of the ambulatory behind it, then the facade, and finally they would build the nave up in between. So it's this really sort of hodgepodge of styles, although we're going to be focusing on the early Gothic elements here. So most new cathedrals were built in this period because of fires destroying many of these older structures that pre-existed. The structures were funded by the raising of taxes in the cities in which they were to be built. The clergy of the area often gave up their salaries or a portion of them to help fund it. And the relics of the cathedrals were often taken on tour to raise funds from pilgrims and the aristocracy of other areas. They're always the most prominent structures in their areas, and I think this image shows that pretty well. You can see the historic and the modern town of Chartres built up around it, and it still dominates the entire landscape. At Chartres, their major relic was a robe of the Virgin, and this was very appropriate because this area was known for textile production. So I've mentioned now a couple of times the major features of the Gothic, but I'd like to go over them again because we'll be seeing those here at Chartres and be talking about them in some depth. You have the pointed arch, you have the ribbed groin vaulting like what we saw at Saint Denis. You have the flying buttress, which we'll talk about even more in depth, but you can see it really well in the exterior of Chartres all the way around the apse end here. And then that level called the triforium above the lowest level of arches in the nave. These all worked together to contribute to the fact that less masonry was necessary for the walls because each of them had a significant structural function. Each is a method of relieving stress from the walls and bringing it down to the ground. Then more stained glass can be put in without compromising the integrity of the walls themselves. Here's another view of it. This time you can see the main facade of the church. This is a photograph showing the processions that might take place. So here you see that robe of the Virgin inside its reliquary. Obviously this is a modern photograph, but I like showing it because I think it gives you a sense of what they used to do with these relics, how these activities of processing these holy objects is something that Catholics have been doing for millennia at this point, and it's still a major part of civic and Christian life in the city. So I wanted to show you this diagram of a flying buttress just to give you a sense of how they work structurally. So here's the sloping roof of the nave you see here, or here in the image on the left. The highest point of the buttress meets the wall just below this roof. This is where most of the pressure from the roof is going to hit, so it needs the most relief. So then you have this arch, because remember arches are very structurally sound, and that brings the weight all the way down to the ground. Just below it, to add even more relief to the wall, and from these arches that come from the nave space, this is the nave we're seeing here, you have another arched connection to the main body of the buttress, which stands out here. Notice that they take the opportunity for decoration, even in this context. And then in this cutaway view, we're seeing the roof of the side aisles, the roofing over the aisle structure, and those even connect to the buttresses. And here you see the pointed arch, which is the roof, which is the ceiling over the aisles here. So you can get a sense of how the wall of the church is relieved by the flying buttress from its couple of arches, but also by the aisle walls. And this allowed the actual walls to be opened up even more. They also had some nice decorative elements. At Chartres, not only do you have flying buttresses, but I just want to point out while I have this image up, regular buttresses as well. So any sort of masonry structure added to the side of a building like this can be called a buttress. It's holding it up. It's supporting the weight of the walls. Here's another nice view showing all of these different buttresses. You can also see here the transept, the significant portal that existed even here. So even on the transept entrance, which is not the main entrance, you have 3 doors going in, and even stained glass here in these rose windows and a row of windows below that, letting even more light into the space of the transept. On the left side, I'm showing you the facade of Saint Foy at Conques, and again, here's the facade of Chartres Cathedral. Notice I'm only calling it Chartres Cathedral. I should say that all of these churches that I'm talking about today are dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady, which is the Virgin Mary. So it's a little easier if I classify them by their city name rather than by their dedication, whereas the church at Conques I'm pretty consistently calling Saint Foy. So at Chartres you have this 2-towered facade, which is a continuation of these Romanesque structures. Although here you've got the bell towers on the facade rather than over the crossing like we saw with Saint Foy. You also have the same idea of sculpture being used over the portal in the tympana here as a didactic tool, although we'll see that the imagery they're choosing is quite different. Even in the facade, you've got an attempt to get rid of as much masonry as possible. And you see that especially in the rose window, but also these very large stained glass windows inserted above the portal. Now you still have quite a bit of masonry here compared to what we'll see with later churches, but compared to the Romanesque example, this is very light and airy. You can even see through the bell towers to the sky behind. That isn't really the case here at Conques. You have a lot of masonry built up over the portal here. All of this is solid wall. Even between these small windows and this very small oculus, you have a lot of stone supporting the weight of the roof. The towers on this west front have very few openings, so it's just not possible with the Romanesque building techniques to get the same sort of things going on at Chartres. Here I'm showing you the main portal. This is referred to as the royal portal. In the center, we see Christ seated, again in that full body halo, and he's surrounded by the four animals, the four symbols of the evangelists. On the left side, we see the ascension of Christ. You see these angels surrounding him, and you can see these angels lifting him up as well. The ascension is the event said to have happened after the resurrection, where he goes up to heaven. And then on the right side, you have the Virgin Mary enthroned with the Christ child in her lap. Because remember, this church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and there's this emphasis on the cult of the Virgin. Notice also in the lintels, you have a significant amount of sculpture as well. And then also on the jambs, you have a lot of sculpture here too. These are showing ancestors and prophets of Christ. So here's a couple of views of these jamb statues. We can consider these column statues, and these had become quite standard decoration in the early Gothic period. These are rather relief-like. They're very much informed by the columns they're attached to. They're very attenuated, long, stretched out figures like we saw with the Romanesque. They're very interested in making these interesting patterns with their drapery. Their faces are a bit stylized. They're really very much informed by their backgrounds. Later on at Chartres, you have other examples of sculpture that show more naturalism, showing an interaction with each other and with the viewer. These don't quite have that. They're not quite lifelike. They have these little smiles on their faces. And later sculptures aren't dictated by their space in the same way that these jamb sculptures are. Here's a comparison of the interior of Sainte-Foy at Conques on the left and the interior of Chartres. At Chartres, you have three distinct levels. You have the nave arcade here with pointed arches. Remember, an arcade is a series of arches. Then you have the gallery or triforium level here. You can kind of get a sense of how there's an open space here. It's walking on the roof of the aisles. And then at the very top, you have what's called the clerestory level. And these are where it features these double lancet windows at the top with all of this stained glass. At Chartres, the vault is 125 feet above the floor, which is a significant height. You can see that these piers are quite different than what we saw at Conques. You have the major masonry pier with attached columns just like we saw there, but look at all of the little colonnettes, all of these little shafts attached to it, which rise all the way up from the column capital and then go all the way through to the vaults. These are where the ribs derive from here. You can also get a sense of the vaulting structure, how different it is than the Romanesque. The rounded arch of the Romanesque has developed into the pointed arch of the Gothic. Pointed arches are structurally more sound. The pressure that would be put on the very center of the arch is distributed very well in this context. You also get a sense of how light and airy this space is and how much of the wall is pierced by these windows. So we have lots of wall articulation in the architecture, but also in the opening of these clerestory levels to be these huge stained glass windows that really impact your experience of the space. Here's another view into these nave ceilings. You can see just how different these are. Now, Chartres has these transverse ribs just like at Conques, but they also have these diagonal ribs that go across. They spring from one pier here all the way across to the opposite side and one bay behind, so it creates this web of a ceiling. You can see just how three-dimensional this roof is. And here, this is a view towards the apse end, so you can see how much light comes in even from that end of the church. So here again is the view of the interior, and now I'm showing you the plan at Chartres. Like we saw with the Romanesque, we have the Latin cross plan, although the crossbar has been brought down just a bit more. Like in the Romanesque churches, you have a continuation between the aisles and the transept, but it's not really for that primary function of pilgrimage like we saw before. Now, of course, pilgrims are going to come to this church, and that's a convenient factor that's carried over from the Romanesque, but it's not the primary aim of these churches. Here you see, just like at Saint Denis, a double ambulatory, and hopefully from the plan you can also get a sense of the complicated vaulting system, just like at Saint Denis. But instead of quite so much connectivity between these chapels, you have more proper radiating chapels that are distinct from one another in the plan, although it still would have been a very light and airy space. Also in the plan, you can get a sense of how rectangular and narrow these bays are. Remember with the Romanesque, they were a bit more regular and square. These have been thinned, which adds more bays overall, but then you can have these fantastic rib vaults, even more than what you had in the Romanesque. You also can see here how small these central piers are. They look quite large, but they're nothing compared to these massive piers that make up the outer wall of the church, and this is where the flying buttresses are connected as well. So this is where the major weight is being carried to, way out here. The windows are all above these small columns, the ones in the clerestory level, that is. Of course, you have windows in these openings between the piers, but the major ones that illuminate the interior of the nave are all over these piers. So you've got your architecture doing a lot of the work to allow this to happen. Now I'd like to move on to talk about the stained glass window inside Chartres. So you see this beautiful light created. You can tell that on a sunny day that the entire interior would be illuminated in these yellows, blues, and reds of the stained glass, how it would create this very different environment than the outside world. Now, you have to keep in mind that people who lived during this time, unless they were very, very wealthy, they would have lived in these drab huts with no color. So being inside the church would have been very astonishing. They didn't even have very colorful clothing. Dye was extremely expensive, so only the wealthy would wear colorful clothes. Here's the view I showed you before, giving you a sense of the windows in the clerestory level. So these stained glass windows are another method of perforating the surface and bringing light in. They're also a place for narrative images. One of the things you want to remember is that the flying buttresses are one of the major features that allows these windows to be put in. Chartres was famous for its glassmaking workshops. It was an expensive and difficult medium to work in. What we have are pieces of colored glass that are fused to lead strips to hold it all together. The point is not just to illuminate the interior, although that's one benefit, but it's to create this heavenly space, just like what Abbot Suger suggested. Here I'm showing you the window called La Belle Verrière, and here I want to talk just a little bit about the stained glass technique. First, you have this huge grid-like structure, this armature made out of lead, and then inserted in that you have even thinner lead lines making this more of a grid-like structure, and then even smaller ones which help make the shapes of everything in the window. So this is this armature of lead that the stained glass would be fused to. So the window I'm showing you here, La Belle Verrière, is a pastiche of an old window that survived from a fire, set into a lancet window. And new additions have been made, especially with these blue panels of angels on the right, so the central image is the older part. Mary is shown in this very traditionally frontal way, which is how we almost always see these religious figures in this time period. But she's shown as this very young Queen of Heaven. You see her big halo around her head, the heavy crown that's topping it, and then right above her, the dove of the Holy Spirit flies in. On her lap is the Christ child who raises his hand in blessing, but he's very small compared to his mother. See how large she's been made because she is the emphasis here. All around Mary, we have a series of 8 angels. You can see them in the larger view on the left. And then also around them are 4 doves, and then prophets and ancestors of Christ. Also scattered throughout is the fleur de lis of France, the lily that was a major and still is a major symbol of France. So remember that Abbot Suger is trying to make the interior as divine as possible to transcend the material world. Although not in this case, most of these windows contained certain stories as a way of instructing the viewers or to illustrate histories or sometimes even stories related to the patron. So maybe a guild would sponsor a window and then they might have images related to whatever their profession was. I want to compare these 2 images just for a minute. So on the left we have the Christ of the Second Coming from the Apse mosaic at San Vitale in Ravenna. And then on the right, of course, La Belle Verrière from Chartres. So in both we have this frontal figure seated, the focal point of the image, but instead of Christ like we have at Ravenna, we have this transition to the cult of the Virgin Mary. Now Christ is still very important, there is no doubt about that, but the Virgin Mary becomes the most important saint, and so you start seeing her featured in this way. You also have a significant difference in the medium here. Mosaic has its own way of creating illumination and the sort of experience of a heavenly world, especially with that gold background. Stained light does something similar, but done in a very different method of doing so. Now I'd like to move on to another Gothic cathedral. It is also dedicated to Notre Dame, and this is in the city of Rheims in France. And it dates from 1211 to 1286, so I'm showing you the facade and the plan. Rheims was the site that served as the coronation of the French king. The Archbishop of Rheims had some political power since he was basically in charge of the king's coronation, so it's got these royal associations. So just for a moment, I'd like to compare the facades of Chartres versus that of Rheims on the left. There's about 80 years of difference between the two facades here, so you can see how quickly the Gothic style develops and even more technological innovations allowing for even more open space. So hopefully you notice some of the major differences here. At Rheims, instead of having a single portal in the center, of course this single portal has 3 doors. At Rheims, the portal expands across the entire facade. Also, we have these significant gables that rise up above the tympana. So each one of these is a tympanum, and above those you have these huge roof-like structures. The central one rises so high that it goes all the way up to the middle of the facade, so it's quite enormous. Now, while we also have quite a bit of sculpture going on the jamb, on the trumeau, around the tympanum, notice that the tympanum itself has now been replaced with stained glass. There is no sculpture here because they could open up even more of the space through further technological innovations. It's just a further development. They're taking more risk. It's not that they're using a lot of new technology, but they're finding ways to make the technology work in new ways. Also, instead of there just being the one rose window, we now have 2. So imagine the illumination on the interior here. We still have the 2 towers, although these 2 match. I forgot to mention before, this one at Chartres is the original one, and the one on the left is added in I think the 19th century, made to look Gothic. That's why they don't match. But notice how much of the bell towers themselves have been perforated. You can see through at nearly every single level. Everything is drawing your eye upward. The only horizontal feature is right here, which is the Gallery of the Kings. And this is really appropriate for the site of the king's coronation to have this Gallery of Kings. So we don't have any more narrative sculpture here except in the top of the gables. And I just want to point out the one that's right here to you. In the center here, hopefully you can see this, you have 2 central figures surrounded by several below them. On the right side you have Christ, and he's holding up a crown and placing it on the Virgin Mary's head. So this is a scene called the Coronation of the Virgin. Now this is perfectly appropriate for 2 reasons. First, it's dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, Our Lady, and he's crowning her as the Queen of Heaven, but also because this was the coronation site for the kings of England, so it was a really appropriate subject matter here. Going back to look at the plan, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the features here. Notice that the transept has almost disappeared. It's very shallow. Of course, there are openings here, especially on this side right here on the north side, but here you don't have much of an opening at all. It doesn't extend that far. The transept, if you were to walk around the aisles through the transept and into the ambulatory, you're hardly moving over at all. Here we have a single ambulatory, and then you have these really distinctive independent chapels, but notice the interesting vaulting system above each of those. It's almost like the double ambulatory still exists, but now there's significant masonry in between them. It's even more narrow than Chartres was, and it's even higher than what we saw before. Here's a view of the interior looking back towards the entrance in comparison with its plan. The amount of glass shown here was made possible by the technique of bar tracery. These are thin stone strips called mullions that form an interlocking grid of glass instead of inserting the glass directly into the window opening, and you can get a sense of that here. The bar tracery can support even more glass than older techniques that were able to. So that heavy lead armature that we saw with La Belle Verrier, that's an early Gothic technique versus the later Gothic, which uses this bar tracery. Notice the interior. In the interior, we have the same sort of compound piers with shafts and colonnettes shooting straight up to the ceiling. You have very high pointed arches. There's your triforium level. And notice we don't have the same amount of stained glass here at Rem. We do have a similar rib vaulting system with transverse and then these diagonal ones here. Notice the capitals here look much more Roman, and that's because Rem was a major Roman center. Finally, notice that the west wall here is completely filled with glass and sculpture. So we have those 2 rows windows that we saw from the exterior, plus another row of stained glass. And then here, all these little sculptures that you see are prophets and royal ancestors, and they're all facing the apse, so they're all looking this way, which is where the coronation of the king would have taken place. So it makes good sense for it to be there. So as the Gothic went on, they were able to make these structures even taller, even more narrow, so your eye would just be continuously drawn upwards towards heaven and towards these magnificent windows. I also wanted to highlight this sculpture that we see here. This is on the exterior of Rome. There's a new emphasis on the Virgin here, and what we're seeing in these sculptures are 2 different stories from the life of the Virgin. Remember, at Chartres, the jam statues were prophets and ancestors of Christ, so they weren't really conveying particular stories as these are here. On the left side, we have the story of the Annunciation. So you see the Virgin Mary standing here, and the angel Gabriel appeared to her, told her that even though she was a virgin, that she would become pregnant with the child of God. And then on the right side, we have the story called the Visitation, where Mary here, who has just found out she is pregnant, goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is also miraculously pregnant, although hers was a bit different. She was just an older woman who miraculously became pregnant. And her child would be John the Baptist, and they were cousins. So you've got these 2 pregnant women who are seeing each other, who are both touched by these miracles. Now, hopefully you notice this significant difference between the style of the sculptures. There's at least 3 different artists working here. So you have the angel Gabriel over here. He's been identified with a sculpture master that's typically called the Master of the Smiling Angel, or sometimes the Joseph Master, and because you can see the little smile on his face. And whoever carved this has several other sculptures on the exterior of the church. You can see he's very distinctive from the Virgin Mary. She's a bit more simple. Her drapery falls in nice patterns, but it's not quite as virtuosic as what you see with the angel. Her face is quite different. It's not incredibly naturalistic. There's not a lot of movement in the body. And then if you look at the 2 figures in the Visitation, you see a major difference. These 2 figures are very highly classicizing, and they come from what is called the classical shop, so this identification of different workshops of different sculptors. They seem to actually be based on Roman examples, perhaps known through metalwork or even local examples. As I said, Rome was a Roman site. Their faces recall Roman portrait heads, and their heavy drapery recalls that of Roman sculpture, as does their contrapposto pose. You see those knees jutting out, you see the shift in the hips. You get a much greater emphasis on the body under the drapery than you do with, say, the Virgin Mary of the Annunciation here. So moving on to our final monument of this lecture, this is the one that is in Paris, France, and this is called Sainte-Chapelle, and it dates from between 1243 and 1248. On the left, I'm showing you the exterior of this structure. Hopefully from the people on the ground here, you can get a sense that this is much smaller than what we've been talking about so far. On the right side, I'm showing you a cross-section, so you can see the proportion of the church from the interior. You have this high-pitched roof with wooden trusses. Then you have this high-pointed arch of the nave ceiling. And here you can see the division of this chapel into a lower church and then an upper church. You can see the little staircases leading up to the upper church here. You can still visit this if you go to Paris. It's actually definitely something to see if you're headed that way. You enter through the lower church, and I've had more than one person tell me that they go in and they think that's it. And somebody has to tell them, no, you've got to go upstairs and see what's going on upstairs. This structure was built by King Louis IX, and he is the Louis who becomes known as Saint Louis. He was sainted after his death. He built this next to his palace to serve as the reliquary for all of the relics he had accumulated. He had quite the collection. These included the crown of thorns, a piece of the metal lance tip that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, the sponge held to Christ's lips while on the cross, and even a piece of the true cross. The reason he was able to acquire these things is because after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which is when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, all of the significant relics that Constantine and other emperors had brought there were dispersed. They were stolen and dispersed across Europe. This becomes his palace chapel. Think about Hagia Sophia with Justinian and the palace chapel at Aachen. And it's associated with a complex of buildings that were part of the royal palace. Essentially, what Louis had made was an enormous reliquary. So as you can see from the interior, think back to the reliquary of Saint Foy, the rich materials used. Well, here he's using the Gothic style and stained glass to lend this divine aspect, this precious aspect to the relics that were contained within. They would have been displayed up here at the apse end of the church, and they're still actually displayed there once a year. I think it's right around Easter. The new Gothic style that you see here has been called the rayonnant style, which means radiant or radiating in French. And it's known that way because of its bar tracery that you can see in the windows. Remember, that's those little thin stone bars called mullions. It's also been referred to as the court style because of its association with the royal court at Paris. So you might see two different ways that this has been talked about. Notice here that there are virtually no walls. All you really have for walls are these clustered colonnettes that frame the very tall lancet windows. The bar tracery technique is what contributes to the amount of glass in the structure. The windows rest on what's called a dado, this very low dado here, so there's a little bit of a wall structure underneath. And this fits into the tracery of the windows and the floor. It's really brightly painted. There's two levels of the structure, as I mentioned. The lower chapel is less impressive, but it's quite nice. It's painted in blue and red and gold. You've got this increasing perforation of the wall surface. And even here, you've got this impulse to create these verticals and pinnacles. So if I go back to the exterior of the building, here you see that all of these pinnacles on the buttresses. Notice we don't have flying buttresses here. And the gables over the roofs and the pinnacles here and even right here, marking it as this important space. Because it's so small, there was no need for flying buttresses. Here we have the highest proportion of glass to wall of any of the monuments we've looked at. The colonnettes that spring up go to these rib vaults that we should be used to seeing by now. You get the transverse ones and the diagonal ones, just like we've seen in our other two cathedrals. And here I think you get a really good sense of the web effect of this masonry that's put inside. You can really get a sense of how thin it is and how it springs from these colonnettes to go up into these ribs. So it's built as a home for relics, which were also contained inside reliquaries, which are then put into this other architectural frame of this altar, and then in this large building itself. So it's this interesting way that they package these precious objects. There are all these layers separating you from the object, and progressively they get more impressive. Again, we have the lancet shape of the window, but they're taller and narrower than we've seen before, and they're used in groups. So each window has two lancets topped by a little oculus. And then again, I want to emphasize the shift away from that grid-like armature of stained glass windows. There's hardly any visible tracery. Just to compare one more time with some of what we've looked at before, you've done away with the nave arcade, the triforium, the oculus level, and the clerestory, and instead it's been developed into only windows. So we looked at Chartres, for example. You can see how the structural innovations of the Gothic led to this ability to create essentially a jewel box to house the relics of the king. So over a short amount of time, we've had a lot of structural and decorative innovation. And here the light is what is casting this aura of holiness, of sanctity on the relics kept inside. It's a really stunning place to visit. Your breath is sort of taken away if you go on a sunny day. It's incredible how different it feels from the outside world, which is exactly the goal of the architects and patrons during the Gothic period. Here's just another image to give you a sense of how amazing this color is in the space and how you are just surrounded and enveloped by the stained glass. So to wrap up, today we talked about these structural developments out of the Romanesque that were still used in the Gothic, and even more so than still used, they were combined in new ways so that they were able to open up the walls. That's the very strong emphasis here, is opening up the wall space. We also talked about the cult of the Virgin Mary rising above all other saints. We saw the emphasis on her with the dedication to her of every single cathedral, essentially, to Notre Dame. We talked about this emphasis on light and precious materials, especially with Abbot Suger. He was the one who promoted this at Saint Denis, to create a significant difference between the outer world, regular earth, what you see every day of your life, and this heavenly interior. So this separation of earth from heaven, because the church is the space of heaven on earth. So now to finish up Module 7, you'll need to take the self-assessment. Next, I'd like you to discuss where we can see Gothic architecture today all around us on the discussion board. And finally, we also have the vocabulary wiki and group 1 that is your turn to take care of this time. So thank you for watching, and I will see you for Module 8 when we move on to the Renaissance.